Welcome, world religion students. Today we are studying Judaism. This is Judaism I. We have 2 weeks of Judaism. I will be posting your discussion questions after this presentation, and you'll be getting an email link to the YouTube video. Thank you for tuning in last week. I really appreciate it. A couple of words. Thank you to all of those of you who attended our optional meeting last Friday. Remember, that is completely optional. I'm here to help. I'm here to offer support for you. I think it was helpful to get some clarity on some elements of the syllabus. So thank you all for attending. Before I start Judaism, let me just say that we are now about to embark on our study of the Western monotheisms. And this is going to be quite a journey. There will be 2 weeks for Judaism, 2 weeks for Christianity, and 2 weeks for Islam. I will say this is where we're starting to get into areas that directly affect the Western world through the Enlightenment in more concrete ways with respect to denominationalism, especially within Judaism and Christianity. So this is probably the part of the course that I also know the most about. I love Taoism, I love Buddhism, Hinduism I've grown to love over time. But now we're getting into some of the nitty-gritty of the Western monotheisms. And here in the West, they have had a particularly large influence on our politics, our culture, the way of life in the United States of America. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Judaism 1. There are a lot of key terms that you need to know for the study of Judaism. Perhaps one of the most common ones that you hear is anti-Semitism, because we are living still in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust. We are living in a context where we see the rise of hate groups, neo-Nazis, etc. And there are continuing conflicts over Israel-Palestine between groups who believe that it should remain the homeland for the Israelis, which was created after World War II, and others arguing that no, this is actually the home of other people. As you guys know, I use the term Israel-Palestine. I don't use one or the other. I try to walk the middle road here. So, anti-Semitism. Let's see here. Kosher. That's a classic one. How do you keep kosher? So, eating kosher foods. Don't mix your meat with your milk. In some Jewish homes, in many Jewish homes, you'll have different sets of dishes because of not wanting to mix the milk and the meat. There's actually a verse, I think it's in Exodus, thou shalt not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. I believe that's the justification for that, one of the laws within Jewish culture. Let's see here, Messiah. That's a big one, especially after the return of the Jews, the Hebrews at that point, and the rebuilding of the temple with the Ezra and Nehemiah period, moving into the time of the Maccabees. You really get this longing for a return to greatness, a return to glory. So the idea of a Messiah, someone who's going to return the Hebrew people to the golden age that they enjoyed under Saul, David, and Solomon, often called the United Kingdom. This was something that people looked for, and of course this also sets the stage for someone who claimed a basileia tou theou, that's the Greek for the kingdom of God. That's going to be the foundation of another religion, Christianity. Next week, we're going to focus more on the differences between Orthodox Judaism and even the ultra-Orthodox and the Hasidim. We're also going to look at the conservative and reform next week. But for right now, we're going to focus a lot on the very basics, the foundations, the history of Judaism. So words like Torah, Tanakh, those are going to show up a lot. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books of the law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Incredibly important books of the Hebrew Bible. Some of you may think, the Hebrew Bible, what is that? Well, the Hebrew Bible consists of books, many of which comprise the Christian Old Testament. So when I say Hebrew Bible, I'm thinking about those books, and I'm not thinking in terms of interpreting through the New Testament lens, which is what Christians typically do. All right, so moving forward, I've got a great quote by a Jewish rabbi named Hillel the Elder. This is one of the articulations of what we call the Golden Rule. In fact, I met a woman at a conference once, and she had all the different golden rules from all the different religions, because almost all of them have a variant of this golden rule. And Hillel the elder gives us this one: what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. Hillel the elder is a later rabbi, and he is roughly a contemporary of Jesus of Nazareth. I think he might be a little earlier. And he is basically articulating the vision of the golden rule here. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. So do unto others through as they would do unto you. So I talked about how Hinduism is the oldest of the institutional world religions. We're really looking at a foundation for the ancient Hebrews around 1900 to 1700, roughly the time of Abraham, the first patriarch. Talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Roughly 1300 to 1200 is when we have Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. Let my people go. The parting of the Red Sea, that classic moment in Jewish history. Roughly about 1010 to 970, we have the reign of King David. And he is the second of the kings in the United Kingdom era. And he is by far the most popular and the one that resonates most throughout Jewish culture. King David is considered the high point of Jewish political identity, despite the fact that he was never meant to build the temple. That was left to his son Solomon. And it's interesting because Solomon later would sort of do some bad things, marry some foreign wives, and put idols in the temple and fall away a bit. And this is why after Solomon, things did not last. His son Rehoboam had part of the kingdom, and there was a revolt, and then a general named Jeroboam took the other tribes. So David is really the high point of this literal Hebrew kingdom in the promised land of Canaan, which is, of course, set in now what is Israel-Palestine. We're going to talk about the northern kingdom of Israel falling, the 10 northern tribes falling to the Assyrians in 722 BCE. We're going to talk about the fall of Judah and Benjamin, the southern two tribes. They fall to the Babylonians in 586. However, they return in about 537, 536 with Ezra and Nehemiah. After Cyrus the Great comes and conquers Babylon, he decides to let the Hebrews that are settled there in the Babylonian captivity, he lets them return and they rebuild the temple. The famous Maccabean revolt and the miraculous moment of the candles and the oil, which is the foundation for the holiday Hanukkah. That is a very important part of this. And this is actually happening in the wake of the ashes of Alexander's empire with the Seleucid dynasty there. 70 CE, the Romans destroying the Second Temple. This is a very important moment, though. The funny thing is that there had been the rebuilding of the temple, and then under the Hasmonean dynasty of the Maccabees, there had been some additions. And one of the additions is actually what's left. It's the western of the Wailing Wall, which is actually the holiest site in Judaism, because it's basically the closest that most pilgrims can get to the Temple Mount. And the temple, of course, was where the Ark of the Covenant was held, the Holy of Holies, and the Ark of the Covenant holds the Ten Commandments. So we will talk about those. There were two variants of the Talmud, the commentaries. The Babylonian was one of them, and that was compiled in 500 CE. And we won't talk about it this week, but moving forward next week, we'll talk about the Enlightenment in Europe and the Jewish contributions to the Enlightenment. And then, of course, 1933, 1945, the Holocaust, World War II, the rise of Hitler, ghettos, etc., and 1948 when the State of Israel is declared. So these are some key dates in the history of Judaism, but again, for today, we're going to focus mostly on the past. So one of the most important terms we need to remember when studying Judaism is the term covenant. God's relationship with creation and later his chosen people are defined by this idea of a covenant, a binding agreement between two parties. One of the most important of these is the flood, right? The Noahic covenant is God's promise never again to destroy the earth, rebirth of humanity under a new deal, and the rainbow is the symbol that seals the deal. That's a classic covenant that God creates. But the most important one of all is the one that made the Hebrews God's chosen people in Genesis, and this is God's covenant with Abraham to make his people a great nation, the Abrahamic covenant. Male circumcision is the sign of this covenant, and this comes to us from Genesis 15 and 17, verses 1 through 27. Genesis 17:6, the verses, "And I will make thee exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee." Genesis 17:6. So this is God's promise to Abraham. The funny thing is at this time, Abraham is really old, and so is his wife Sarai. And he doesn't really know what's going to happen here. God, how are we going to do this? But God makes it happen through a miracle. And the funny thing is that Abraham really didn't kind of trust this, and he had actually had a child with his servant girl, Hagar, and her son was Ishmael. The interesting thing here is that within Islam, Ishmael is the chosen bloodline through whom we get the line of descendants, whereas in Judaism, it is Abraham's son through his wife Sarah, Isaac. So a very interesting point there. Covenant is one of the key things here. God, basically, you are bound to this, and as long as you are holding up your end of the deal, God will bless you and make you fruitful, etc., etc. But as the Bible shows, time after time after time, the Hebrew people will fall away. This is why prophets are called to call the people back to true worship of God. You're going to see this even during the time of David with Nathan. You're going to see this later on with people like Elijah, Elisha, Jeremiah, Isaiah, the minor prophets. But there's an entire body of literature of prophets calling the people back to true worship of God. It's very interesting because when they went into the land of Canaan and wiped out the Amalekites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Amalekites, all of these tribal people, it's pretty clear that the high places where people had actually continued worshiping at were places where these people had worshipped as well. So there was a lot of syncretism and a lot of stuff going on that the later authors of these texts did not want people to be doing. And basically, these were bad things, and we have to stay true to our monotheism. The interesting thing is that perhaps the earliest Hebrews might have been henotheistic, and that's the idea that there is one high God and there is other gods. That's classic among indigenous traditions. We've talked about Native American and African traditions, and so this idea of one high God and other gods beneath is actually quite common. This is a variant of polytheism. So when exactly the ancient Hebrews went full monotheistic, we aren't entirely sure. It's a question. Don't trust me. This is an interesting topic of debate. So when did this become purely monotheistic? So that's a really interesting question. I think it's probably rather early. Who knows what, and one of the names, the most important names, is Yahweh. When did Yahweh become the only God instead of the high God? Let's see here. There are classic moments in the history of Judaism. Moses is incredibly important. He's the one that led the people from Egypt. He's the one who stood up to the Pharaoh. He's the one with his brother Aaron who did all the signs, and you had the plagues and everything to get out of Egypt. There's an interesting tradition with Moses where sometimes he's depicted in sculpture with horns because there's a mistranslation of a Hebrew word that a later Latin Christian father, church father named Jerome, mistranslated something, and it says that Moses grew horns. So if you see Moses, a statue with Moses somewhere with horns, that's just a mistranslation. And it really speaks to the importance of textual evidence passing on in the telephone game of history. So a really interesting point there. And of course, the classic moment for Moses is the parting of the Red Sea. One interesting element here is the idea of trust. One of the really controversial sections of Genesis is the binding of Isaac. This is Genesis 22, verses 2 to 8. This is where God says, guess what, Abraham? It's time to sacrifice, make a sacrifice of your son. And Abraham's like, well, wait a second, didn't we make a deal that you would make a great nation of me? And God is basically, as some people interpret this, testing Abraham's faith here. It's quite controversial. This is one of the key tenets of the worship of Yahweh. This is about obedience. You have to obey Yahweh. There was a moment where King Saul actually conquered a people, I think it was the Amalekites, later on, and God said, put them all to death. And Saul spared the women and the children and the cattle, and God said, you weren't supposed to do that. And for this disobedience, I will take your kingdom from you. And he did and gave it to David. So Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible, it's pretty much about obedience, trust of Yahweh, and connection to that idea of covenant. I made a deal with you, you have to hold to that. And on the social, cultural level of the people on the ground, it's about identity. The identity, of course, through male circumcision. This is who we are. Okay? Another classic moment that I love to talk about is the David and Goliath moment. This has become a cultural thing. You have a boxing match where you've got, this is a David and Goliath. So from 1 Samuel 17, verse 26, and David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? Well, what's that? What's the context behind that? Well, the Philistines, most likely a western people, probably the Phoenicians, who had a god named Dagon. This group of people was obviously polytheistic, or at least henotheistic, and they were muscling in. Probably the Hebrews were muscling in on their territory, and they were fighting back. And this giant Philistine in the army is there basically saying, who's going to face me? And this is a classic moment where you have the greatest warrior of an army saying, okay, come fight me. And everybody on the Hebrew side is backing down, except for this boy, David. And when David takes his sling and slays Goliath, hits him with a rock, and then stabs him with the sword, this is where the legend of David starts growing. He is a shepherd boy, but somehow he is chosen. There is all sorts of stories in Samuel. The prophet Samuel is the one who finds him. And this boy is going to become a special king. And along the way, it's going to make King Saul very, very nervous, because King Saul doesn't like the fact that this kid just went out and killed this giant in this way and became a hero overnight. There is a classic connection of David's son Solomon to the wisdom tradition of ancient Judaism, and in fact in Christianity. Solomon was considered very, very wise. So the story goes that there were two women, and they both claimed a child as their own. And of course the king, people will bring, problems to him that need to be solved, judicial issues. And he is there, and the two women are fighting over whose baby this is. And the one says, well, it's my baby. And the other one says, no, this is my baby. And then Solomon wisely says, okay, bring me a sword. We're just going to do this the easy way. We're going to cut this kid in half. And of course, the real mother says, no. Let her have the baby. The liar says, fine, do it. And of course, Solomon then knows who is the true mother of the baby. This is the most famous story of Solomon's wisdom as a ruler, especially early in his reign. So it's a classic moment. He is identified with the book of Proverbs, one of the wisdom literature books. So one of the things that you're always going to run into when you study ancient Judaism and the Hebrews is that there's always contest. There's going to be claims of, okay, your God is not the most powerful God. And one of the main competitors in the land of Canaan / Israel-Palestine, modern Israel-Palestine today, is this fertility god, thunder god Baal, right? So the thunder god Baal, I believe the Canaanite version of the fertility goddess is Ashtaroth. And you have this prophet Elijah, who is later on in the story, and he is having a contest with the prophets of Baal, and they're going to see which God is the real God. And of course, the contest is, well, we're going to offer a sacrifice and you offer a sacrifice. And Elijah says, okay, well, let's do that. And Elijah, because he is so sure of himself, decides, let's pour water on my sacrifice that I'm offering to God, because, he's still going to make it burn up, because I trust in the Lord. And the prophets of Baal are they're circling their sacrifice and nothing's happening, right? And Elijah, and this is one of the trash talk moments, one of the classic trash talk moments of the Hebrew Bible. This is where it is. This is verse 27, 1 Kings 18, verse 27. And at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. In other words, maybe your God's just not up right now. And of course, he's just mocking them, and then with his own sign, he calls upon God, and God sends a fiery lightning bolt and boom, everything goes up in flames. And of course, the prophets of Baal flee in terror. And Elijah is, justified in his belief in the true God. So very interesting moment in the First Kings. I love the stories in the Hebrew Bible that are all about proving Yahweh is the true God against these false idols. Okay? The rebuilding of the temple, once the Hebrews go back in about 537 BCE, they go and rebuild the temple. The Persian king Cyrus the Great is celebrated in these prophetic books. It's so interesting how in the Greek tradition in Herodotus, Cyrus the Great sort of starts this traditions where the Persians become the bad guys in the Greco-Roman part of things. But for the ancient Hebrews, Cyrus is a hero because he has liberated them from Babylon and they get to return and rebuild their temple. Very important, interesting moment there in the history of the Hebrews. Hanukkah. Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, celebrates the Maccabean revolt of 167 to 160 BCE and the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean dynasty would come to an end when there was sort of warring factions in a civil war, and the Romans would come in under Pompey the Great and be like, no, I'm taking over now. And it would become Judea a Roman province. So that's an interesting connection there. And of course, the Maccabees before that had been under the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He is widely reviled because he will not let them worship. And the Maccabees, when they revolted, they took the temple, and miraculously, the oil lasted for a number of days before they could get new oil. And this is the celebration of Hanukkah over the 9 nights. I believe the 9 candles is the old one, and the 7 candles is the newer version. But fact check me on that one. So we're going to talk more about Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, next week. We're also going to talk more about Yom Kippur. These are 2 of the most holy days in Judaism. The interesting thing is that just like every other religion, Judaism has holidays and festivals that it celebrates on an annual basis. When we did our Create Our Religion projects, which unfortunately we couldn't finish, I wanted you to realize that when you talk about religions, you're talking about rituals that go on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis. These are the rhythms of our lives. And within Judaism, it is exactly the same. Judaism follows a lunar calendar. Okay, so you have, much like Islam, which also follows this lunar calendar, you have, roughly, for example, Hanukkah roughly falls in the month of December. All right, so let's get moving on the early history and talk about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the 12 tribes. So the big 3, okay, so yes, the creation myth, Adam and Eve, right? And then you have Cain and Abel, the first murder. And then you have Noah and the flood. These are all important stories. The Tower of Babel. These are all important stories that build the creation narrative of the ancient Hebrews. Note that Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, and some would argue because they were disobedient, because the woman and the man both listened to the serpent who tempted them. And then they had to eke out an existence on earth. So there is this idea of an early paradise and then a fall or an expulsion from that paradise. Now the Christian interpretation would call this a fall. I shouldn't say that with respect to the Jewish situation because their take on it is different. So when I say the word fall, I probably scratch that. It's a different interpretation within Judaism. But bottom line, Adam and Eve have to go their own way. They are expelled from the Garden of Eden. So ultimately we end up with, after the Tower of Babel, after Noah's Ark, we get to a moment where there is a man named Abraham. And he is living in roughly that area, Sumeria, Babylon area. And Abraham gets a promise from God that God will make a great nation of him. And of course, he's old when this promise happens, but he does have a son named Isaac. Isaac, often the understudied of the 3 patriarchs, Isaac has 2 sons. He has Jacob and Esau. Esau is the firstborn, and there's actually this really interesting story how Esau is this sort of wild, swarthy hunter-type guy. He's got really hairy arms. He's just that sort of, manly man guy. And Jacob is more favored by his mother, Rebecca. And there is conflict between them. Jacob seems to be a bit of a trickster type character. He's a really interesting cat. Jacob is really, really interesting. He's one of the most interesting people in the entire Hebrew Bible. I'm fascinated with the stories about him. I'm fascinated with the 12 tribes, the stories of Joseph as well. But his mother pushes him to get the blessing that is supposed to go to Esau. So he puts deer skin on his forearms. His father is blind and old. He's about to die. So he goes up to him and he gives him this soup, this venison soup or broth. And Isaac is going to bless him. He's like, well, your voice sounds like Jacob, but your arms feel like Esau. And of course he tells him that it's Esau. And then Isaac blesses him and gives him the blessing of the firstborn, which is going to continue this bloodline, this promise. And of course, Esau comes back. It's too late at that point. He gets a different promise. He's going to be a warrior. He's going to travel the land, but he's not going to be the chosen one. And so Jacob gets the blessing and steals it from his twin brother. So a really interesting story. Jacob, of course, will go on to have Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and another wife. I'll get to her. Well, they're actually slave girls. There's 2 wives and then 2, I guess you could call them concubines, that Jacob's going to have multiple children with. So that is the big 3. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yeah, so through his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and his concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah, Jacob, who also becomes known as Israel, has sons who become the tribes of Israel. They are Reuben, Simeon, Levi. Levi notably becomes the priestly class, does not get land of their own. Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Manasseh, and Ephraim. Now, that blessing went to Joseph, but Joseph has a completely different story that we'll get to. Joseph's sons end up getting the blessing through him. His sons are Manasseh and Ephraim. And then finally, the last son of Jacob, the youngest, Benjamin. Okay? The northern kingdom, known as the 10 lost tribes, fell to the Neo-Assyrians in 722 BCE. Judah and Benjamin fell to the Babylonians in 586 BCE. So you have the 12 tribes, you have the priestly class with Levi, and they're in charge of all the laws and writing and putting everything together, the laws of the people that are contained in the Torah. And so that is the first part of the story. Oops, excuse me. Yeah, so the story of Joseph goes like this. The brothers of Joseph were pretty jealous of him. He was his dad's favorite. And they didn't like that. So they decided that they were going to leave him to be sold into slavery and take his coat of many colors and put goat's blood on it and show their dad and say, hey man, he died. He was killed and we're sorry. And so Jacob believes that his son is dead. Joseph gets picked up by some slave traders and is later, because he has many, many gifts, he can read dreams, visions, he becomes second in command in Egypt. Okay, he becomes the vizier to the Pharaoh. And there will be a great famine in the land that he figures out what to do about it. And ultimately his family, his brothers, will come looking for grain from him. And so through a lot of series of events, Joseph ultimately reveals himself to them. He's reconciled with his family. And the Hebrews, they safely come and settle in Egypt. And the book of Genesis pretty much ends with the death of Joseph. And then the book of Exodus begins with, well, guess what? After Joseph died, the next Pharaoh did not know Joseph and did not really care a whole lot about the Hebrews. And that leads to the story of Moses and the Exodus. And that story is a fabulous one. Moses is put in and this is a classic mythological trope, by the way, for a child to be put in a basket, sent down a river. The same thing happens roughly with Romulus and Remus, for example, in the Roman foundation myth. And Moses is sent down the river. He's picked up by an Egyptian princess, raised in the royal house, I believe. And then he somehow becomes aware of his identity, and he sees a slave master whipping one of the Hebrews, who was supposed to be building bricks for buildings. Some people say the pyramids. There is no proof that any of that ever happened historically. But be that as it may, Moses loses his temper, kills this guy, and then finds his identity as the spokesperson and leader of the Hebrew people. He and his brother Aaron, through a number of miracles and wonders, through God's power, show the power of God to Pharaoh and basically say, you've got to let our people go. And if you don't, this is going to happen. Well, guess what? This is going to happen. We got boils, we got frogs, we got locusts, we got all sorts of plagues. And then finally, there's going to be one last plague. You got to let us go. The angel of death is going to fly over, and if the sign is not painted with blood on the lintel and the doorposts of the house, the firstborn of all across Egypt will die. And in fact, pop culture note, there's a Metallica song from Ride the Lightning called Creeping Death that is an homage to this moment in Hebrew history when the angel of death flies over and the firstborn is killed all throughout Egypt, except for the people who did exactly what was instructed. You had to paint the blood on the doors, you had to make a certain sacrifice with a certain lamb, and you had to go through all of these ritual preparations to assure that your firstborn was not killed. And there's wailing and lamentation all throughout the land of Egypt, and finally the Pharaoh says, fine, go. Moses gathers the people, they go, Pharaoh changes his mind, chases after them. Okay, this is the point, the crossing of the Reed Sea or the Red Sea. And this is where Moses parts the Red Sea. They're crossing through, and of course they make it, and then the waters come and sweep the chariots away. One of the classic Moses stories. There are so many Moses stories, I can't even get to all of them. Moses, of course, is called to go up the Mount Sinai and receive the tablets of the law. While he's up there, I believe for 40 days and 40 nights, a classic number in Hebrew religious history, Noah's Ark, 40 days and 40 nights. While he's up there, the people lose faith, and they decide that they're going to create their own god, a golden calf. So they throw all the rings and everything together, and they built the molten calf, and they start worshiping it. And of course, Moses comes down, his face is glowing, he's got a veil on, throws the tablets down, they break, and he has to go back up and get other ones. And the people are punished for this. They have to wander now in the wilderness. Okay. Of course, they build the Ark of the Covenant, within which the new tablets are contained. In the Holy of Holies, it's a movable shrine. And of course, during the day, it's got a pillar of cloud over it. By night, it's a pillar of fire. So this is the Holy of Holies. This is the law, the 10 Commandments, which we're all familiar with. Okay? Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet their neighbor's wife, etc., etc. There are so many. Thou shalt have no other gods before thee, right? This is the moment of pure monotheism. And so these tablets of the law are contained in the ark, okay? And they are traveling in the wilderness for 40 years. And then ultimately, they will finally gain entrance. The 12 spies moment, I believe, from the book of Numbers. A spy from each tribe is sent in to check to see how we can get in and defeat these people in the land of Canaan. Moses, however, does something and loses the trust of God, so he's not allowed to enter. A lot of people think, oh, Moses, he made it the promised land. No, he didn't. He was not allowed to enter. So after you get the period of Joshua, who's the next big leader after Moses, he goes into the land of Canaan. They start conquering all the tribal people in the area. There's the famous moment of Jericho, circling of the city, the walls of Jericho, Joshua. And then there's a period of judges. And some of the judges have some really interesting stories about them. They're male, they're female. It's one of the most egalitarian moments in the history of the Hebrew people. I love the story of Samson. You can look that one up. Gideon's got a great story. There's even a left-handed guy named Ehud. He's got a really great story. I can't really dwell on those stories now, but the Hebrews have these judges who are interpreting the law and making sure the community stays together. They don't have kings, okay? They remind me a bit of the Roman Republic. They're afraid of kings, okay? They're afraid of this. They don't want it. But at some point down the line, the people really start wanting a king. And then, of course, they find someone from the tribe of Benjamin to lead them. His name is Saul, okay? Saul starts out okay, and his reign is okay for a while. They're finding where they need to establish their capital in Jerusalem. And Saul does okay for a while. Then he disobeys God, and God decides to transfer power to the next king. And that king who rises up is David. David is incredibly important in the history of the ancient Hebrews. He's the one that does much of the conquering and the expansion of the territory, beating all the tribal people. He is not perfect, however. There are some incidents that show him to be just like anybody else. There's the taking of Uriah the Hittite's wife, Bathsheba, for which he is chastised and punished for the death of his firstborn of Bathsheba. The prophet Nathan tells him a story about that. I wish I could get into it, but I can't for the sake of time. So David also survives an attempted coup by his son Absalom, and it's ultimately, they figured out that Solomon's going to be the one that takes over. And Solomon does take over after the death of David, and he's the one that's going to build the temple. And indeed, he does. So the first temple is where the Holy of Holies is deposited. This is like the high point of ancient Hebrew history. Okay, you now have the priestly class with a location in Jerusalem with the temple. So this is the moment. However, Solomon starts to fall away. He starts putting different idols in the the temple. He starts marrying different foreign wives. Things start getting ugly. God is not happy. What's going to happen next is his son Rehoboam is going to take over, and there's going to be a civil war, in effect, between Rehoboam and a general of Solomon named Jeroboam. Jeroboam is going to take control and lead the 10 northern tribes, and Rehoboam is going to keep control of the 2 southern tribes. And ultimately, from that point on, you've got a split, okay? And you've got the different kings that rise in these different areas. And then, of course, the Assyrians come in, and I've talked about the Assyrians, what they would do to conquered peoples. They don't leave a lot left. They will wipe you out, and that's pretty much what they did. In the narrative, that's what they did. There were groups of people still left. The Samaritans, for example, probably stuck around. Their religion was different by the time you got to Jesus. So historically, there were people who were left behind. And there was syncretistic religions of the mix of the Hebrew religion and the native religions. That was always happening. But the texts will tell us that, everybody was taken away, everybody was wiped out, and we are the returned remnant. And these are the ones from the 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Judah and Benjamin fell to the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, the famous Nebuchadnezzar, the one with the hanging gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And the 10 northern tribes had been lost to Sargon II and Sennacherib of the Assyrians already in 722. And it's really with Cyrus the Great that you're going to get the return under Ezra and Nehemiah. So what are the beliefs? Well, monotheism, the Greek word monos, means one. Theos means God. Okay, one God, the creator of the universe. And there are many names for God. There is the Lord, El Shaddai. Elohim, Yahweh is the most powerful one. This is the name of God that cannot be written or spoken. It's just traditionally not done. I am, as a scholar, I can do that. But Yahweh is, it's actually the letters YHWH, because ancient Hebrew did not have vowels in the script. You had to fill those in. But we say Yahweh today. Prophets arose among the ancient Hebrews to reveal the Torah and to call them back to their religion. I talked about that. Scripture, the Torah is the repository of the religious, moral, and social laws that guide the life of the Jew. Okay? And it's also known as the Pentateuch, Penta, 5. So the first 5 books are known as the Pentateuch. And the Hebrew Bible was later incorporated into the Christian scriptures as the Old Testament. So there are 613 commandments in the Torah. The Talmud, or the oral law, is the commentary of the ancient rabbis. It explains how the law of God applies in daily life. These laws pertain to all areas of a Jew's life, including dietary rules, kashrut, kosher, clothing, weekly worship, Shabbat, the observance of holy days, including Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, Passover. This is the one where the angel of death passed over the houses of those who had painted the blood on the doors and had followed the ritual instructions of Moses from God. And of course, they follow the law with respect to social relationships in the home and in business dealings. And next week, we'll talk more about how that's expressed in contemporary Judaism with respect to Orthodox, conservative, and Reform traditions. But it's always the case that the Torah and the Talmud, as commentary on it, has informed how the Jews are to live, okay? How you dress, what you eat, what you don't eat, the sign of the covenant, of course, male circumcision. So the Tanakh is basically the word we apply to all of the Jewish scriptures. I'll get to what that is specifically. And the Talmud, of course, as the oral law. And the Talmud is actually two parts. The Mishnah, which is the first part, is the first collection of oral law written down roughly 3rd century of the Common Era. Okay? The birth of Rabbinic Judaism, by the way, happens at the same time as Christianity. And a lot of people look at Christianity as a separate thing, but if you see Judaism, it splits into two almost twin siblings that go different directions. It goes Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. And the Mishnah is a huge part of this. We have people like Hillel the Elder who are instrumental in the foundation of Rabbinic Judaism. So we have the Mishnah, the first part of the Talmud, and then the Gemara is the second part. It is the rabbinical analysis and commentary on the Mishnah. This is incredibly important. Rabbinic Judaism would become an extremely text-based, interpretive religion, where you're really looking at interpreting the text and applying that to your daily life. This is going to be the major concern for the Western monotheistic religions. These are incredibly text-based religions. So the interpretation, you would call it hermeneutics. I believe it's called midrash in Judaism, the idea of interpretation. All these are incredibly important things. How do you interpret it? Do you interpret the text literally? Do you look at it with a more historical critical approach? Do you look at the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter? These are questions that have been debated and analyzed in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam for centuries. And Judaism is, of course, the first. So let's talk about the Torah. The Torah begins with Genesis, the creation narrative, the first murder, the flood, the establishment of the covenant between God and his people, the patriarchs, the 12 tribes, and the settlement in Egypt. Exodus, the story of Moses and his deliverance of the Hebrews from Egypt, although not yet into the promised land. It begins after the death of Joseph under a new pharaoh unsympathetic to the Hebrew settlers. Leviticus, which is based on the name of the tribe of Levi, the priestly class. These are instructions for the priests about how to perform rituals and keep the laws. The book of Numbers recounts the trials and wanderings of the Israelites in the desert for 40 years and presents more laws. The 12 spies, one from each tribe, are dispatched to spy on the land of Canaan for, you guessed it, 40 days. And finally, the book of Deuteronomy. Another account of the law comes from the Greek word deuteros, meaning second, and nomos, law. It consists of sermons from Moses exhorting the people to follow the laws as they prepare to enter the promised land. So that's the very first part of Deuteronomy. All right, so the Torah, incredibly important part of the Jewish scripture. The next section is the Nevi'im, and I deeply apologize. I did not study Hebrew, so my pronunciations are going to be bad. Let me talk about the prophets. Prophets are not oracles. This is not like the Oracle of Delphi where they predict something, give you some cryptic message, and then you're supposed to interpret it some way. That's not what they are. They are messengers of God who call the people to repentance and back to true worship of God. I've already talked about one of my favorites, Elijah. He's a classic, okay? The arrival of a prophet in the text usually means that the people had forsaken God's laws. The prophets routinely railed against people worshiping in the high places or the local shrines. That's what they're called, the high places or the local shrines. This was because the polytheistic Canaanite tribes worshipped their gods at similar shrines. This is about formation of an identity through text. So this is later Jewish authors writing about how their identity has to be different, and they are writing about the rejection of the people who worship in the high places. This is a place of polytheistic idolatry. This is not where we worship. This is not what we do. And the Nevi'im is divided into two sections, the former and the latter prophets. The former are Joshua, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. I have to be honest with you, those are probably my favorite books of the entire Hebrew Bible. There are so many amazing stories. If I had to choose one section of the Hebrew Bible to read, that would probably be it. I've read all of it, but that section is my absolute favorite. The latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, there's some really intense stuff there too. The 12 minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay, so there's an entire section of Hebrew scriptures devoted to the prophets who are calling people back to true worship of God. And then finally, the Ketuvim, the third section of the Hebrew Bible. It's the writings. These are the texts of poetry, wisdom, literature, songs, history, and philosophy. There are 12 books in the Ketuvim: Esther, Job, Ruth, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Songs, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Chronicles. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. One of the classics is Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. One of the classic psalms there. Pardon me for using the King James Version. I typically use that version, even though I probably shouldn't. I highly recommend, if you want a more historical or a better text that is less poetic and less nostalgic, it's nostalgic for me, go to some other versions of the Tanakh to get perhaps a text that is closer to the original Hebrew. I just tend to lean towards the later version in the 17th century, the King James versions within the Christian element there. So please, I apologize for that, but all right, so the Tanakh. The Hebrew name for the entire Bible is Tanakh. It is formed by using the first letter of each section and making a word. So T is for Torah, N for Nevi'im, and CH are for Ketuvim, Tanakh. All right, and remember, in Hebrew, there are no vowels in the ancient Hebrew. All right, and I've got a picture here on my PowerPoint about a great moment. Job 1, 6 through 12. God and Satan talking about whether Job will turn away from God if everything is taken away from him. Satanas, the adversary. This is one of those really awesome stories, and you get what would later become identified with the devil here. So Satanas, the adversary there. Really, really interesting story, the book of Job. And of course, he doesn't fall away from worship of God, despite the fact that everything is taken from this man. It is brutal what is taken from Job. And he's got 3 friends who are like, dude, man, why are you still hanging tough here? Like, the God forsaken you. Like, give up. Stop worshiping him. And Job doesn't listen to them. They are the tempters. They are sort of agents of the adversary there. All right, so let's talk briefly about the Talmud. The Talmud is the most important text of Rabbinic Judaism, as it outlines Jewish law and comments on the Torah. It has 2 parts, the Mishnah and the later Gemara. The Talmud represents the sum of the commentaries and legal analyses by later rabbis in the ancient Near East between 200 and 500 CE. So this is happening roughly the same time as you get the foundation and the formation of Christianity. Really, really interesting. This is another, just Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, and Christianity are finding themselves and forming their identities at the same time within the same Roman Empire in the Mediterranean basin. Okay, there are so many things I could talk about with respect to how the Romans are involved here, especially with the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, but we'll move on. There are 2 versions of the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. Some of the Jews that had been in Babylon never left. Remember that some of them had returned to rebuild the temple. Some did not leave. And then some settled back there. So you have 2 versions of the Talmud here, really interesting. The Mishnah are the legal opinions and debates, and the Gemara is the later discussions of the Mishnah. And the word used to describe the way the rabbis read and interpreted the Torah in the Talmud is midrash. It means study or interpretation. When used with capital letters, however, midrash refers to a medieval compilation of rabbinic writings between 400 and 1200 CE. So you have even more commentary by the rabbis in the Midrash happening in the Middle Ages. This is a process of textual interpretation that is ongoing, that never ever stops. And this is one of the interesting things that I love about the monotheistic traditions, is that textual interpretation is so incredibly important. It also makes differences very fractious, and it also leads to a lot of fracturing of communities, because one person say, my interpretation is correct, one religious leader says this, and another says, no, this is the way we keep kosher, this is the way we do this. And so you get splintering of communities. And this happens in these traditions quite a bit, actually. All right, so this has been a presentation on Judaism, the first one. I look like I was able to stay under an hour. I'm actually kind of surprised and shocked that I did that, because I have a lot to say about Judaism. To really summarize the history of Judaism, this is about covenant, this is about law, this is about identity formation. One of the interesting questions I have is, like, how many other groups were out there that had texts and were somehow destroyed? We know about a small group of people that managed to write about their history and keep the evidence together, that we can read and interpret and learn about their history in ways that there are so many tribal people out there, we don't know much about them at all. And we know a lot about the ancient Hebrews, and we know a lot about Rabbinic Judaism. So it's really fascinating to me all the wonderful things that we can learn about the ancient Hebrews and their monotheistic moment. They are the world's first monotheists that become a global institutional religion. And Judaism has become incredibly important because it is the religion from which, well, besides the fact its own tradition moving forward, it's a tradition from which Christianity comes, and it's also a tradition from which Islam draws a lot of influence as well. Because Islam is formed in the Arabian Peninsula when there's Christian and Jewish minority groups in the area. There's also, of course, native Arab traditions. There's a lot of stuff going on in the Arabian Peninsula at the time. And so the influence of Judaism on the other two major monotheisms is incredible. And one of the things that interests me and saddens me is that these religions share so many textual, they share so many texts, they share so many stories, creation myths, they share all of these narratives. And I've said this before, you can have people in other parts of the world, you could have, for example, Zen Buddhism is probably a Buddhism influenced by Taoism, perhaps. It's hard to say you can't really say, like, I'm a Jewish Muslim, or I'm a Jewish Christian, or I'm a Christian Muslim, or a Jewish Christian. Like, these are really difficult things to talk about, because the exclusive truth claims of these religions, especially the more conservative variants of them, make it really difficult to get to the bottom of why there's a lot of conflict in different parts of the world about these religions. In the United States, for example, post-Enlightenment, we have what's called denominationalism. We can have different religions where they have different truth claims because by law, we follow the Lockean principle, person and property are off limits. And so we don't, there's no theocratic pretensions there in the West. But there are parts of the world where that is not the case. So when we study the Western monotheisms, we really have to be aware of their truth claims, how those truth claims are interpreted, whether those truth claims are strictly scriptural or cultural as well. One of the important things we often don't talk about is how cultural differences get connected to and justified by religious truth claims. So there are a lot of interesting questions and conversations we can have. Of course, this is more about introducing Judaism to you, the rich history of the Torah, or the Tanakh, I should say, and getting into conversations about what it means to study the first of the world's major monotheisms. So Judaism, incredibly important for understanding the Western world as we know it. And that's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and get this posted, and I'm going to get some discussion questions posted as well. Thank you all, and have a great night.